الحمد لله الحمد لله حمدا كثيرا طيبا مباركا فيه مباركا عليه كما يحب ربنا ويرضى جل جلاله وعم نواله والصلاة والسلام على سيد الحبيب المصطفى صلى الله تعالى عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وبارك وسلم تسليما كثيرا إلى يوم الدين أما بعد. My dear respected ulama, my dear respected brothers and our sisters, wherever you're listening, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's difficult to discuss the biography of someone because depending on one's affinity with how people will receive different ways and process it in different ways. Mulla Ali al-Qari, I'm sure the majority of us here have probably heard of him. Is anybody here that hasn't heard of Mulla Ali al-Qari? Somewhere or the other. If Fadail A'mal, Sheikh Zakaria quotes him often. If you're from the ulama fraternity, there are numerous books that I'm sure many of us have benefited from. So Mulla Ali al-Qari is a very comprehensive individual. He's a very multifaceted scholar that's worked on a number of different subjects. And I think I'm going to try to highlight a few points from his life because his entire life is not in front of us anyway. I mean, I haven't come across any very detailed biography. His date of birth is not known. That's kind of normal because there wasn't a birth certificate system around the time as far as I understand. He was born in Herat, which, yes, current day it's in Afghanistan, but you can't call him an Afghani scholar, I don't think, because I don't think there was enough. Was there an Afghan at the time? He's actually Khurasani. Because when you look at the makeup of the Islamic world, without getting too much into the geopolitics of the time, you had two major areas where, if I'm to probably say that the majority, well, not necessarily the majority, but a great bulk of Islamic scholarship came from. And much of the work has been produced. That was Khurasan, and it was Ma Wara'un Nahr. Transoxiana, which was in the north of Iran, which is currently Uzbekistan, the surrounding areas, and the other area was Khurasan. And this area, I think it was first established, I think it first rose to great prominence during the time of the Samanids. This was within the 2nd century, the 3rd century, the 4th century. That's why you had the greatest scholars come from them. You had Imam Bukhari come from Bukhara, which is in Uzbekistan, currently Uzbekistan. You had Tirmidh, where Imam Tirmidhi hailed from. You have Sijistan, which is just south of that area, which is Imam Abu Dawud came from. You had Imam Muslim, who came from Nishapur or Naysabur, which is further south from there, which is in current day Iran. You had Abu Layth al-Samarqandi. I mean, you just had numerous scholars that hail from the area. Nasafi, some of the biggest names that you've heard from, they were either from that area or the others, they were from Baghdad and Damascus, Sham and other areas. But some of the major contributions were made by these areas. So this is Khurasan, Herat and Balkh, which are two prominent cities in Afghanistan today. Although Balkh isn't really what it used to be before. Balkh used to be a major center, probably one of the greatest centers. And Balkh was destroyed, I mean completely destroyed at least twice, once by the Tatars, and then after that due to some internal rivalry and fighting within the Muslim factions. But that was a very glorious city. That's Balkh, and then you had Herat, which was close by to that. Herat and Balkh, both of these, though they were Khurasan at the time, part of Greater Khurasan, and then further north was Transoxiana, which is Ma Wara'un Nahr. Now both of these cities are in Afghanistan. They obviously don't have much of their former glory, but they were literally centers that people would actually go to. In fact, if you look at the Hanafi school, a lot of the development in the Hanafi school formed in Balkh, right, which is close to Herat. And now that gives us an understanding where this scholar that we're looking at today, Mulla Ali al-Qari, Ali ibn Sultan Muhammad al-Qari, hailed from. He hailed from a place where there was a heritage. There was a lot of development in terms of the sciences. I mean, he studied a lot in the Jami' Masjid of Herat. You know, in the earlier days, there were not necessarily as many madrasas, because each masjid, each grand masjid, each Jami' Masjid, each Friday mosque as such, I mean, that held students. They had numerous teachers, very proficient scholars in the different sciences, and they would go and study in these areas. So he hailed from Iraq. He hailed from Herat. Now, this is we're talking about we're talking the late 17th century Gregorian, right? And we're talking late 10th century, second half of the 10th century, early 11th century Hijri. This we don't know his birth date, but we do know that he passed away and departed from this abode in 1014 Hijri, which is about 1606 Miladi, right? That's about, how many years is that? It's about how many years is that? 500 years? So that gives us a basic understanding of Mulla Ali al-Qari. He moved from Herat to Makkah Mukarramah, and the reason that he moved is initially Herat and that area, after the Samanids and so on, the Taymurids were ruling Herat, and then they were overthrown by the Safavid dynasty. Now the Safavids, they were, you could say, they resurrected Persian culture again. I mean, they were Shiite, they were Rafidis, right? They were Rafidites or Rafidis, and they took over Herat. This was Shah Ismail the first. Later on, Abbas and so on came in. They're the ones who built much of the great architecture that you have in Iran today. But the Safavids, they took over, and I guess the rule changed from Sunni to Shiite, not just Shiite but Rafidi. And because of that, that was one of the impetus for Mulla Ali al-Qari to leave the area, and hence he departed. He departed to Makkah Mukarramah, and this is something that used to happen often from different parts, different parts of the Muslim world. People would have this longing for Makkah. I mean, this happens until recently, except that now there's extreme restrictions in terms of who can live in Makkah and Medina Munawwara, and thus, you don't have a mass exodus of people. But there are numerous people who even today move over there under some pretext, with some excuse or the other, because they want to be close to the two holy sanctuaries, the Haramain. While I was in America, one of the brothers that I had there was from Medina Munawwara. His father was originally from Bhopal, which is a city in India. And in about 1912 or something like that, at the age of 12, he hid on a ship. He hid on a ship from India to Mecca, to the Haramain, to Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula, and he left home at the age of 12, alone, hid aboard a ship, and he settled in Medina Munawwara. The interesting thing is that he did that, and both himself and his wife, they passed away recently. The interesting thing I want to mention to you is that when people do this, they do it with a zeal. There's something in their hearts that makes them want to do this, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts that calling from their heart. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts it. So it's not some kind of mundane movement. It's actually very significant, right? It's linked to a spiritual longing that they have to be close to the house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or to Medina Munawwara, to the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And hence this individual I'm speaking about, when he passed away, now if you've been to Jannatul Baqi, right? If you've been to Jannatul Baqi, which is the graveyard of Medina Munawwara, there are, unmarked graves that just go on and on for, many meters. And anybody, especially a normal person, a normal citizen of, normal person who's come to visit, or a normal resident of Medina Munawwara, if they're going to be buried, they're going to have to go with, wherever the next allotment is. So the family had no idea. They went to the graveyard as normal after bathing the Mayyit and praying and so on. And when they got there, as soon as they entered, now you know that area where as soon as you enter, there are graves of some of the Ummahat, al-Mu'mineen, radiyallahu anhun, and some of the family of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And Ajib, as they got in, his son is telling me that as soon as we got in, there was a man there saying, is this so and so? And he took his name. Is this the mayyit of, is this the funeral of so and so? And they said, yes, it is. He said, yes, bury him here. You know, you normally get a place right in the corner on the other side. You know, if you go to a janazah there, that's where you'll get it. But this person was given a place here. He was an engineer. He worked on the new construction of the Haramain, both Makkah and Medina Munawwara. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepted him, that he got not just a burial in Jannatul Baqi, but very close to some of the, you know, some of the best of this ummah. Just purely by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Nobody knew who that man was or anything, but it was just all organized. Okay, bury him here, khalas. That's it. Interesting thing is, his wife, which is the mother of the person I know, she was extremely ill. Now, Medina Munawwara doesn't have the hospitals there aren't as well equipped as those in Jeddah. Jeddah is the main kind of city on the western board. And they had taken her to Jeddah despite her not wanting to go. I mean, she was reluctant to go because she just wanted to pass away. She was old, she wanted to pass away in Medina Munawwara. And they insisted, the children insisted, no, we have to, you know, see if there's a cure for your problem and so on. So finally she went. On the way back, she was just like, take me home, take me home, take me home. Every few minutes she's asking, are we in Medina yet? Are we in Medina? Now if you've traveled by car from Jeddah to Medina Munawwara, that's about 4 to 5 hours drive. And she's asking, are we in Medina yet? Are we in Medina yet? And they're saying, no, no, no. Eventually, as soon as they hit the borders of Medina Munawwara and they entered, and she asked, are we in Medina Munawwara? They said yes, and she passed away. I mean, it's ajib how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts these people, their entire life's longing, and finally Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us a good death, husnul khatimah, because those are some of the interesting things that we need to take from, especially from these great individuals like Mulla Ali al-Qari, who also passed away in Makkah Mukarramah and is buried there in the Jannatul Mi'lat or Mu'allat, which is the graveyard of Makkah Mukarramah. While I was in Umrah just last year, I was joking with one of the tour operators who's a resident there, who's originally from Bangladesh, but he's been in Medina Munawwara, he's been in Makkah for a long time. And I said, because he's everywhere, wherever you went, you know, you would see him, you know, he just moves around. So one day I said to him, "Aap to Makkah ka badshah hai," you know, just a joke. I said, "You're the king of Makkah." So that's when he got serious. He turned around and he said, "What are you talking about calling me the Makkah ka badshah? There are people here who are more, you know, who have more right to be called the kings of Makkah." What he meant, he explained to me. He said, "There are people I know here. You know, you don't know who you're standing next to there. It's an amazing place. You don't know who because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to accept people, very special people to come there, right? So you don't know who you're next to." He said that there's one individual I know, a Sudanese brother, who's been living there. He lives in Makkah Mukarramah, but he works in Jeddah. Now in rush hour, you know, it takes about an hour minimum, 50 minutes to an hour to get from Makkah, to commute from Makkah to Jeddah. But he insists on living in Makkah, even though you could get a better house probably, right? Because in Makkah it's congested, you don't really get so much space, right? But when you go to Jeddah, you know, you can have what you want. Despite that, he insists on living in Makkah Mukarramah, just so that at least when he comes back after a day of work, he can have his Isha prayer in the masjid, and maybe his Fajr prayer. That's not all. He said that this man is such that 4 of his children, each one of them was named by the Prophet ﷺ. Whenever his wife was pregnant, he would see a dream in which the Prophet ﷺ would appear and he would name the child for him. So we're talking about some serious, you know, we're talking about some serious spirituality here. And these people who've tasted it, they really understand it. Mulla Ali al-Qari had this longing. There was an impetus to move out because of the rule that came over them in Herat, and he moved out. And maybe that was one of the reasons why he became even more popular than he would have in Herat. You know, you have many prominent scholars from Herat, Hirawi. Any scholar that you see at the end of his name, Hirawi, that means he's from Herat. However, the prominence you could gain in a center like Makkah Mukarramah, where people are coming from the entire Muslim world, and you're able to benefit. So though he had studied a number of subjects in Herat itself, after he moved to After he moved to Makkah Mukarramah, he studied even more. He became a great Qari of the 7 ways of recitation and the various different modes of recitation. He became a great Qari, and that's why he called him Mulla Ali al-Qari. Although we probably know him more, the scholars today would probably know him more as a muhaddith, as a mutakallim of sorts, as a theologian, a scholar of Aqidah, a scholar of Islamic theology. You'd know him for his hadith, books on hadith, his commentaries on hadith. One of the most prominent ones that have been published is his commentary on the Mishkat al-Masabih. And Mishkat al-Masabih is an amazing book, and Mulla Ali al-Qari himself says that when I went to Makkah, I had the honor of studying Mishkat al-Masabih, and he gives a range of scholars that he studied that kitab under. It's a very, Mishkat al-Masabih, just to give you an understanding, in the subcontinent, that when you study that year is called a mawquf alayh. It's like your contingent year. That's your next year of Dawratul Hadith, where you study the 6 famous collections. It actually depends on you having studied Mishkat al-Masabih. The way I look at Mishkat al-Masabih, when you study that book, Allama Baghawi initially, and then Allama Tabrizi after him, the compiler of the Mishkat, they collected together some of the most prominent ahadith from the major collections and some additional collections, and ordered them in their various chapters, and gave you a glimpse, a perspective of this rich heritage that's contained in the 6 main books and the additional books. So if you've studied Mishkat al-Masabih, you get a good idea of what's to come in the 6 books, because minus all the repetitions, minus all of the similar ahadith, he's taken some of the most comprehensive ones, put them together, and it's a beautiful collection. Mulla Ali al-Qari, he went and wrote a commentary on that. And the commentary he wrote is kind of indispensable for anybody who studies the Mishkat today, because number one, he's only 400 or 500 years before. There were other commentaries before that, written by scholars centuries before that. What Mulla Ali al-Qari, the advantage he had is that he's kind of a later scholar. You know, if you split the Islamic 1400 years into 2, you know, Mulla Ali al-Qari falls into the second half. And thus what he's able to do, both in his books on Aqidah, his books on Hadith, is that he's able to look at all of the writings, all of the contributions of the past, and then able to formulate his own opinions based on that, take the best from that, respond to what, you know, he doesn't approve of. Like, for example, if you look at the Mishkat, the Mirqat, which is his commentary on the Mishkat, he speaks of, he takes a lot from Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, but he also responds to what he thinks, where he thinks Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, the great hadith scholar, has erred. There is this kind of a Hanafi Shafi'i tussle throughout. You know, you do see that, you do see that, right? And some people have criticized Mulla Ali al-Qari, 1 or 2 individuals from the Shafi'i background, they've criticized him for being a bit too harsh. But other scholars, I mean, even scholars of hadith, scholars that, even scholars actually that don't affiliate themselves to any one of the 4 madhabs in particular, any one of the 4 schools in particular, like for example, Nawab Siddiq Hassan of Kannauj in India, right, who was a famous scholar of what they call the Ahlul Hadith as such. There was also Allama Shawkani, and both of them have actually written that the allegations against Mulla Ali al-Qari in terms of him being too harsh, and some of the allegations actually state that he criticized the Imams themselves and not just the later scholars. He criticized Imam Malik, he criticized Imam Malik on, you know, keeping the hands on the side as opposed to tying them together, folding them together. He criticized Imam Shafi, but those seem to be unfounded. There's been throughout history, when you look at books of Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani or any of the other scholars of madhab, you do see that there's responses that are given to the application of hadith by followers of another school, and that's completely normal. That's completely normal. The other thing is that these were the people who've criticized him, they were contemporaries. And, you know, sometimes in contemporaries there are issues. There are issues, and, you know, you can't really take a contemporary's word for granted, because there are other underlying motives and issues there as well. I mean, I don't want to belabor that point, but in order to understand Mulla Ali al-Qari, when he moved to Makkah Mukarramah, he managed to study under a range of different ulama, you know, from different parts of the world that had also moved there. You know, he studied under Ibn Hajar al-Haythami, right, al-Makki, the great Shafi'i scholar. He studied under Sheikh Ali al-Muttaqi. I mean, that's one of our Sheikh Uwais's most famous scholars, as far as I understand. He studied under him. He studied under Nawab Qutbuddin, who's the narrator of the prayers for forgiveness from Hassan al-Basri. Right? He studied under him. He studied a number of other scholars. I don't want to take a whole list because that may not be beneficial to all of us with the limited time that we have. But what had happened was, until the Uthmanis took over, until the Uthmanis were placed as you can say the custodians of the holy cities, right? Before that, you had the Mamluks and you had others. The movement in the Islamic lands, especially to Makkah Mukarram and Medina Munawwara, wasn't as easy. With the Uthmani Caliphate and with the Haramain coming under that, things became very easy, became open, because you had this vast Uthmani dynasty that was ruling a very large expanse of land, many different areas. So it was easier for people to come. Thus you had numerous people from different areas that suddenly wanted to come to Makkah Mukarramah and Medina Munawwara, just like Mulla Ali al-Qari did, though he had other reasons as well. So now what you had is you had some people who wanted to come there just to make ibadah, just to retire and make ibadah. You had some people who wanted to be there to go and benefit from some of the pious awliya of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that were resident there. Then you had others who wanted to come and benefit from the knowledge that was there because of the ulama that had established themselves there and become resident there. And because of that, you had a lot of ulum that was being disseminated around the time. Unfortunately, now you go to Medina Munawwara, you don't have the same thing. You don't have the same thing. I mean, as far as I understand, teaching Quran is something you can get a license for in the masjid. If there's an alim and he wants to do some teaching in Medina Munawwara, unless you follow a particular manhaj and you want to teach a particular thing that is extremely regulated by the authorities, right, by those who are in charge there, everybody else gets a chance to teach Quran. That's why you have scholars at so many different pillars throughout that are teaching Quran, qira'ah. That's completely fine. It's more open. That is permissible. But when it comes to any other subject, it's difficult, right? You have very few scholars who are teaching aqeedah, and that's only taught according to one particular manhaj as such, or one strain. Again, fiqh, there may be a bit more wus'ah and a bit more broadness in that, but it's not what it used to be. I mean, you had people come and you'd meet scholars of different areas, in the earlier centuries, and you could meet some of the greatest scholars of the world in Makkah Mukarramah or Medina Munawwara. Then, so the doors were opened by the Uthmanis, and that was also around the time when Mulla Ali al-Qari went there as well. Mulla Ali al-Qari, in terms of his personal life, now I'm having to give you a very brief kind of overview of his life. He spent his entire time, he wasn't a very sociable person in the sense that he didn't go and mix with too many people all the time. He was focused on his learning. I mean, if you look at the number of books that he's written, some have given the number at 300 and more. When we're talking about 300 books, we're not just talking about a few pages or articles. We're talking about some serious work. We're talking about volumes. So for example, the Mirqat is at least 8 volumes. Then he's got commentaries, he's got original works on many different subjects, and especially a number of different, probably the bulk of the 300 would probably be small treatises, which are, small articles on very specific subjects. I'll cover some of those to give you an idea of the different subjects that he wrote on. Okay. And when you talk about his personal life, he was very content with a little. His entire focus was study and teaching and writing. And that's why the way he earned his living was very interesting. I mean, when you look at that and you just think, subhanAllah, if only I could do the same thing. Because many of us were involved in different vocations. You may be working in the council, you may be driving a taxi, you may be an engineer, you may be whatever. But to have even your source of income be the Quran as such, right? It's kind of very interesting. Mulla Ali al-Qari was a calligrapher, a master calligrapher. And it seemed that anything he touched, he became proficient in it. So he became a master calligrapher. Right? So he's a khattat. He used to, this much most of the sources mention that he used to write one Quran a year. One mushaf, one Quran, he used to write one copy a year. And then he used to sell that. And with that money, that was sufficient for his yearly expenses. Some say that he used to write two. One would be sufficient for his expenses, the other he would donate. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the tawfiq to do something like that. Because even your source of income is the deen through the deen. I mean, you're not using it to, we're not saying that your purpose is the income, but at the same time you're doing something for the deen even when you're doing that. That's a very interesting thing. Any calligraphers here? That's another dying art, poetry, calligraphy. It's a major problem, especially in the English-speaking world, English-speaking Muslims. So that's the way he used to earn his living as such. But an ascetic, he was just focused on his connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, his writing, his studying, and his disseminating. He's got numerous students, and again, this is not the time to mention an exhaustive list of his students, which obviously is going to be very large when you've got people from all over. He benefited from numerous different various different heritages he was able to benefit from, because when you've got Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, you've got Suyuti, who benefited from much of what Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani wrote. I mean, these are some of the big names in hadith studies, for example. And then you've got the students of Allama Suyuti, right? And then you've got Sheikh Mulla Ali al-Qari, who benefited from the students of Suyuti, and thus he is linked to that silsila as well. So he's able to take from them, and when you look at his Mirqat, for example, in his other books, you'll see the way he's able to juggle between the different opinions. He's able to respond to great masters like Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani and then provide his own opinion. It's quite remarkable. The one thing that I find, for example, in Mulla Ali al-Qari's works is that they're comprehensive. They kind of seem to hit the point. Because when you're reading a hadith and you're looking for a particular you're looking for a particular angle, Mulla Ali al-Qari will discuss it, right? He seems to hit the point. He seems very kind of forward-thinking in that whatever he wrote seems to be very applicable today. You can benefit from. Number one. Number two, he's not terse in his expression. He's not difficult. His writing is not complicated. Though he takes on complicated issues, but he's able to write in a very lucid, very eloquent style. And you see in many places actually he's quite poetic. He's got a lot of rhymes, where even his normal prose there's a lot of rhyme. So he seems to have a very strong mastery of the Arabic language, and he's able to use it in a way, because you've got numerous scholars where if you try to read their work, you have to really spend a lot of time in trying to get to what he's really trying to say, and really trying to open it up and explicate the text. With Mulla Ali al-Qari, it's normally quite simple. I mean, I was able to work on for the Fiqh al-Akbar, for Imam Abu Hanifa's al-Fiqh al-Akbar, was able to work on Mulla Ali al-Qari's commentary, and thus we selected many portions from Mulla Ali al-Qari, and there you get to understand the way he's able to correlate between many different opinions and present them in a very simple and lucid fashion. According to some scholars, they consider him the mujaddid of that century. Ibn Abidin al-Shami, the great Hanafi scholar, he considers him to be a mujaddid of his time, and there are also a number of others who've considered him to be that as well. For example, some of his there are two ulama that they consider to be. There are two ulama, one was him and one was another scholar that they considered to be a mujaddid, a reviver of that century. Because though you had Makkah Mukarramah and you had people of different backgrounds, Mulla Ali al-Qari was able to deal with a number of different subjects. And the amount that he was able to produce, the writings, his scope of writing was such that he became one of the most famous scholars of Makkah of the time. And he's actually gone down into history as one of the famous scholars of Makkah at the time. He passed away in Shawwal of 10,014 Hijri. 1014, just after the millennium. He passed away in 1014, which is 1606. in Makkah Mukarramah, and he's buried in the Jannatul Mu'allat. In some, they've even given a description. And for those who may want to go and look for his grave, there are descriptions as well for that. I'm just going to quickly go through, just to relate it to what we're speaking about here. You've got the 40 hadith collections. The 40 hadith collection that we'll be speaking about today, Sheikh Khalid will be speaking about, and that's available behind, is his collection on it's a collection of 40 hadith on the Quran. And when I read that work, when it was in production, I was just amazed by the collection, because the different ahadith that he's collected together, he's formed a very comprehensive collection. It gives you a very good understanding of the benefit of hifz of the Quran, the benefit of really pondering over the Quran. And I think that's something, if we can say that the majority of us sitting here are from the Indo-Pak subcontinent, right? One thing that majority of us are deprived of is actually understanding the Quran directly in its original form. And I think it's something that we need to start at some level. Seriously, because you really cannot appreciate the Quran without that. It is extremely important, and it's not something that's beyond one's ability. I know a number of people who've been able to do that. Right? One mustn't fear that if you start learning a bit of Arabic, you'll start giving fatwas. I've seen numerous people who actually learn Arabic, and it makes them more humble, because then it really gives them an understanding of what true scholarship is all about. Because that's when they really understand the difficulty in understanding it. There is this kind of misunderstanding or misconception among our people, that if you learn a bit of Arabic, then you'll become a kind of a loose scholar or something. That's not very true. You have loose aspiring scholars who are kind of become a bit notorious here and there, but that's not because they learn Arabic. That's just because of who they are, right? So one must not become deprived of this. And seriously, it's something that one really needs to focus on. He's got a number of other collections, Arba'in collections. I'm going to mention them because I know Brother Yahya is sitting here from Turath, just to give him ideas. And there's also other books that I want to point out. Some of his books, many of Mulla Ali al-Qari's books have been published, but there's a few that I find very interesting, and if somebody can actually work on them, that would be great. He's got another 40 hadith collection on marriage, on nikah, right? Just in case you knew or you didn't know, I don't know. And then there's another 40 hadith collection on hadith al-Qudsiyya. The hadith, the divine narrations, if you want to call them that. He's got a number of books on mawdu'at, or fabricated narrations, or narrations that are popularly known by people but are not necessarily very strong or very authentic. So he's written a number of books on that, al-Masnu', then he's got al-Asrar al-Marfu'a fi al-Akhbar al-Mawdu'a, al-Azhar al-Manthura fi al-Ahadith al-Mashhura. He's got a number of books on that subject. The two books, one is Mirqat, which is a commentary of Mishkat, which is already published and it's used widely. There is a book called al-Qari, Sharh Sahih al-Bukhari. I don't think it's been published, but that would be very interesting, because that's a commentary of Bukhari. There's also a commentary of Muslim that's ascribed to him, the Sharh Jami' Sahih Muslim. That would be very interesting as well. Then he's got a Sharh of the Musnad of Imam Abu Hanifa. And then he's got other books on usul. And then he's got a tafsir of the Quran that I don't think has been published, in 3 volumes. So you're talking about some big majestic works on different sciences, not just one subject. And then you've got another part that he really focused on. One book of his is extremely popular in that regard, are litanies. Awrad, books that, collections of adhkar and remembrances and du'as and supplications. One, al-Hizb al-A'zam, which I'm sure many of you know about. That's Mulla Ali al-Qari's work. He's also actually got a commentary on the Hizb al-Bahr of Ash-Shadhili. Then he's got a number of books on the seerah. Then he's got a number of books on commentary and poetry. So again, for Yahya, he's got a Zubda fi Sharh al-Burda. He's got a commentary of Burda, and according to Kashf al-Dhunun, according to Haji Khalifa, hiya min ahsani shuruhiha. Right? It's one of the best commentaries. Right? It's one of the most beautiful commentaries of it. Then he's got a commentary on the Banat Su'ad, another famous poem. And then he's got a sharh, a commentary on Ihya Ulumuddin. I mean, that's a vast book. He's got a commentary on that, and then he's got what some would consider a summary of it, which is called Ayn al-Ilm, Sharh Ayn al-Ilm wa Zayn al-Hilm. That's another book. He's got books on fiqh, the Fathu Bab al-Inaya. Then he's got books on theology, Minah al-Rawd al-Azhar, which is the commentary on Fiqh al-Akbar, Sharh Wasiyat al-Imam Abi Hanifa. Then he's got another one on a commentary on the Bad al-Amali, which is a poem in Aqidah, Maturidi Aqidah. And then he's got a number of other books. In fact, and I'm trying to get hold of this book, he wrote on very specific subjects. He wrote on the Easter egg, which is kind of very interesting, because just the other day, I went to a store and they said that, if you find the egg, then you'll get a prize or something. And I was just thinking, how would that be in terms of an Islamic perspective, looking for an egg and so on. And he's actually got a book, because there's some people who came from the Christian lands, and they brought this up to him, and he wrote this book on the whole concept of the Easter egg and the Nasara and so on and so forth. So he wrote on some of the very particular subjects. We don't have time to go into all of them, but just to give you another idea is that he talked about the asa, for example, or that it's a sunnah of the anbiya. So he wrote on various different things. Very multifaceted scholar. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the ability to benefit from his works, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the ability to produce others that are like him to deal with many of the contemporary and later challenges. Wa akhiru da'wana anna alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.